Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take a stack of fascinating sources, articles, research, and our own notes, and distill them into the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight for you. Today, we're diving into something Benjamin Franklin said, a statement that's really echoed through American history.
Right, the famous one from when he left the Constitutional Convention back in 1787. Someone asks him, what have we got, a republic or a monarchy?
Exactly. And Franklin's reply was so simple, but wow, so profound. A republic, if you can keep it.
It's packed with incredible weight, isn't it? That phrase, if you can keep it, it implies, that this form of government isn't automatic. It takes work. It's an ongoing thing.
Yeah, an active responsibility.
Yeah.
And that sentiment, well, feels particularly relevant today, doesn't it, as we're navigating some pretty choppy waters.
It really does. It makes you ask, are we actually keeping it?
And that question is exactly what we're unpacking in this deep dive. We're looking at what feels like a current identity crisis in America, specifically around its core democratic values. And we've pulled together, well, quite a mix of sources for this.
Yeah, we've got a bit of everything. There's a detailed journal article focusing on civic virtue, which we'll get into. Also, a really lively philosophical discussion we found over on Reddit, which was interesting.
Oh, yeah, that was quite the thread.
And then some more academic analyses looking at Plato's Republic, going way back, and also modern takes on virtue ethics.
So our mission today is really to try and cut through some of the noise. We want to understand this, frankly, alarming decline we're seeing in public trust and what's called civic virtue.
We'll dig into its roots, definitely.
Right.
And then explore solutions, looking at both historical ideas and, contemporary proposals. We're trying to figure out how we might rebuild that societal atmosphere. That's the word the source uses, the kind of atmosphere that's needed for both democracy and free enterprise to really thrive.
And we'll try to connect that ancient wisdom, like from Plato, with the challenges we're facing right now. Always asking, what does this actually mean for you listening right now? So let's get started. Okay, so Franklin's warning that if you can keep it, it really hangs in the air today. When you look at the pulse of the nation, it's clear that question isn't just, some abstract historical thing. It feels like a real anxiety for a lot of people.
Absolutely. So let's start by just sort of taking the temperature. How many Americans really feel like our republic, our democracy, is under threat?
Well, the data is pretty stark. A June 2023 survey, for instance, found nearly half of Americans believe democracy is working not too well, or even worse, not at all. That's almost half the country.
And that's not just a one-off finding, is it? The year before, 2022, the data showed 62%, a significant majority, agreed with the statement that American democracy is currently under threat.
62%. Wow.
Yeah. The key thing here, I think, is that it's not just some vague feeling of unease. It's a widespread sense that the fundamental systems might actually be failing, or at least faltering badly. And that makes collective action, solving big problems together, feel incredibly difficult.
And you definitely see a desire for change. People aren't just sitting back. They seem to want things to be different. There was a 2021 survey where a huge majority, 85% of Americans, felt the political system needed either complete reform or at least major changes.
85%. That's a massive number. It points to a really deep frustration, a yearning for things to just work better.
So the obvious question then is, why? What are the common explanations people are pointing to for this crisis?
Well, when you look at the data, there's certainly a lot of finger-pointing going on, especially, between the political parties.
The other party blame game. Yeah, that June 2023 poll we mentioned showed that too. Political polarization is often cited as the big reason. Roughly half, 47%, blamed Democrats for failing democracy.
And even more, 56% pointed the finger at Republicans.
So basically, a lot of people on both sides feel like the other side is the problem, which kind of keeps the cycle going, doesn't it?
It really does. It's a cycle of mutual blame. But the critiques go beyond just the parties. A lot of people are also taking aim at modern capitalism itself.
Right. The argument you hear is that our free enterprise system, as it works now, basically fuels greed and corruption. And that gives a wealthy minority way too much control over politics and laws.
Exactly. The idea is that this kind of setup frustrates the democratic will. People feel like their voices don't matter because money talks louder.
So when voters try to push for, say, more income redistribution or higher taxes on the wealthy, the argument goes, corporations and the rich just use their leverage, their money, their lobbyists to block it.
And this constant blocking, this perceived frustration of democracy, chips away at public faith in the whole system. people start to feel powerless, cynical.
What's really interesting, though, is that this isn't just a critique coming from, say, the left wing.
Not at all. You also hear similar complaints from people who call themselves national conservatives. Their argument, which really gained steam during the Trump presidency, is that global capitalism is the problem.
How so?
They argue it harms ordinary Americans by, outsourcing jobs to other countries, and at the same time bringing in immigrant workers who might work for less. They see it as devaluing homegrown workers.
And they blame who?
They point to what they see as these cozy, and it's a fundamentally undemocratic relationships between the moneyed elites, the global corporations, and the policymakers. They feel the system is rigged against the average Joe, the average American worker.
So it sounds like even though they're coming from different political perspectives, there's a shared concern about power, influence, and whether the system is fair.
There is. And interestingly, the proposed solutions often sound surprisingly similar, whether they're coming from the left or the right critics of the current system.
Like what?
Well, very often, the answer involves stronger government control over economic institutions, more redistributive taxes are often mentioned, and stricter limits on things like international trade and immigration.
So more government intervention, essentially.
Pretty much. There was a recent survey of academic experts talking about how to balance capitalism and democracy. And they actually all agreed on one core point. The single most important step is re-empowering governments.
Really? Across the board?
Yeah. Now, they differed on how exactly to do that. Some favored more regulation, others focused on progressive taxes or wealth taxes. But the fundamental idea of strengthening government's hand was consistent.
Okay, so that really frames the central tension we're looking at, doesn't it? The common diagnosis from these critics seems to be basically stronger democracy requires weaker capitalism.
That does seem to be the bottom line for many. But our main source for this section, this article called America's Crisis of Civic Virtue, it pushes back on that. It suggests that these attacks, whether aimed at capitalism or democracy, are actually misguided.
Misguided. Okay, so if blaming the system, capitalism, or polarized politics is missing the mark, what is the real issue, according to this source?
Well, this is where it gets really interesting. The author argues that the most plausible root cause is the decline of civic virtue.
Civic virtue.
Which immediately raises the question, what exactly is civic virtue? And why would its decline be so central to this whole American identity crisis? It shifts the focus, doesn't it? Away from the external systems and towards something more internal, like personal character and shared norms.
Yeah, it definitely does. Let's dig into that. Okay, so if civic virtue is potentially the root cause here, we need to get a handle on what that term actually means.
Yeah.
Our source defined it pretty clearly. It says it's the set of personal qualities associated with a civil or political order.
Right. And more specifically, it's a shared set of behavioral norms and basic moral rules that make the order's functioning possible. So, think of it like the invisible software that a healthy society runs on. Things like honesty, civility, responsibility, maybe even patriotism to some extent.
The operating system for society. I like that. And this isn't some brand new concept.
Oh, not at all. You can go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, the French observer who wrote about early American democracy in the 1830s. He was really struck by this.
What did he see?
He believed that this civic virtue, this voluntary commitment by citizens to behave in certain ways, like being honest, being civil, participating in their communities, he thought that was the bedrock of the whole American experiment. It underpinned both democracy and free enterprise.
And crucially, he stressed that you couldn't just guarantee these things with laws and police.
Exactly. Laws and coercion have their place, obviously. But Tocqueville saw that the real strength came from this internal voluntary commitment. People chose to act virtuously, for the most part. You can't legislate good character, essentially.
Right.
It has to come from within the people.
Which makes intuitive sense. But the founding fathers, they weren't entirely sure Americans actually had enough of this civic virtue, were they? There was some anxiety about it from the start.
Oh, absolutely. A lot of skepticism, actually. They knew they were taking a gamble, setting up a republic that relied so heavily on the character of ordinary people.
Can you give an example?
Sure. Think about John Adams. In January 1776, just 6 months before they declared independence, he wrote this really worried letter to Mercy Otis Warren. He basically asked if there was public virtue enough to support a republic.
Wow, even then.
Yeah. He worried about the rascality, venality, and corruption he saw, the avarice and ambition, the rage for profit and commerce everywhere. He was genuinely concerned that the basic character of the people might not be strong enough for self-government. He saw potential cracks right from the beginning.
And James Madison, often called the father of the Constitution, he kind of echoed that, didn't he?
He did. In 1788, arguing for the Constitution's ratification, he wrote, "To suppose that any form of government will secure liberty or happiness without any virtue in the people is a chimerical idea." A pipe dream, basically. He knew a lack of civic virtue could doom the whole project.
But he also seemed to have some faith, right? That people were generally wise enough to make the system work.
He did. He believed that ordinary Americans were, on the whole, sufficiently wise and virtuous to use the democratic structures, elections, representation, to choose good leaders. So you see this tension right there at the founding. How much do you rely on the structure of government, the checks and balances, versus how much do you rely on the character of the people living under it?
It's a fundamental dynamic, structure versus character.
And that brings us to a really crucial element that civic virtue helps build: trust. Without virtue, trust is hard to come by.
Okay, explain that link.
Well, political theorist Kevin Vallier breaks down trust into a few key forms within a society. First, there's social trust. That's just our basic confidence that other people, even strangers we interact with in the marketplace or on the street, aren't generally going to cheat us or harm us.
Right, the sort of day-to-day assumption of goodwill.
Exactly. Then there's legal trust. That's our faith in institutions like the police and the courts, believing they'll enforce laws fairly and impartially.
Okay.
And finally, there's political trust. That's our confidence that government officials, whether elected or unelected bureaucrats, won't abuse their power for personal gain or to target their political opponents.
So social, legal, and political trust. And civic virtue is what underpins all of them.
That's the argument. Honesty, civility, fairness, responsibility, these virtues are what make those different layers of trust possible. When virtue declines, trust erodes across the board.
And is there actual evidence for this connection beyond theory?
There is, actually. An economist named Johann Groflund did a big study looking at data from 80 countries over a 30-year period, from 1990 to 2020. His findings are really quite striking.
What did he find?
Well, first, he found that civic virtues like honesty and civility in free markets actually reinforce each other. They create a positive feedback loop. Second, he concluded that trust is fundamentally foundational. It lies directly behind civic virtues, the rule of law, and democracy itself.
So trust is the glue.
It's the essential glue. And furthermore, he found that civic virtues are positively correlated with people's own reported life satisfaction. People are happier in societies with higher civic virtue.
That's fascinating.
And one more thing. The rule of law enhances well-being, but it does so specifically through building trust and fostering civic virtues. So these aren't just abstract concepts. They're directly linked to tangible outcomes, like how satisfied people feel with their lives.
Wow. The real insight there seems to be that these virtues aren't just, nice things to have. They're like the invisible infrastructure that makes everything else work: a functioning market, a stable democracy, even personal happiness.
Precisely. Without that virtuous infrastructure, the whole system and our own well-being within it starts to wobble and potentially unravel.
Okay, this sounds like a pretty strong counter-argument to that idea we heard earlier, the one that says stronger democracy requires weaker capitalism. If trust and civic virtue are foundational to both, maybe the relationship is more complex.
Exactly. How do capitalism and democracy actually intertwine in a way that might benefit both?
Yeah.
If that virtuous foundation is there?
Well, Michael Novak argued back in 1982 in his book, The Spirit of Democratic Capitalism, that there's actually a natural logic leading from capitalism to democracy.
What was his thinking there?
His basic idea was that citizens who experience economic freedom, the freedom to choose, to compete, to own property, naturally start to desire political freedom as well. Economic choice becomes a kind of training ground or precursor for political choice.
That makes sense. And didn't Michael Mandelbaum make a similar point?
Yeah, the political scientist. He explained the link by saying that capitalism gets people used to expressing individual choices in the marketplace, voting with your dollars. And that habit, that expectation of having a choice, naturally carries over into the larger political system. If you can choose your brand of toothpaste, why shouldn't you choose your political leaders?
It's about a consistent sense of individual agency. Now, we should acknowledge that carryover isn't automatic, right?
Right.
I mean, look at China. They adopted freer markets, but democracy didn't exactly follow.
True, it's not a guarantee. But the broader social science picture does seem to back the general idea that Novak and Mandelbaum were getting at.
How so?
Well, the economist Benjamin Friedman pointed out that the big expansion of capitalism globally in the late 20th century was associated positively with the spread of democracy. He noted that in the 1970s, fewer than 50 countries had significant civil liberties. By the end of the century, it was nearly 90.
And crucially, those countries also saw rising average incomes during that period.
Right. So economic growth and political freedom seem to advance together in many places. And Friedman stresses there's basically no evidence of a trend in the opposite direction. You don't really see democratic regimes collapsing because countries adopted market economies.
The pattern consistently shows them growing together, or at least not being inherently antagonistic.
And here in the US, you could argue the relationship is even more symbiotic, that democracy actually helps foster capitalism in certain ways.
Explain that.
Well, think about America being largely founded by immigrants. Many were fleeing systems that were less meritocratic, where they had little chance to advance socially or economically. They came here seeking opportunity.
Yeah.
So, historically, these groups have often resisted the kind of sweeping economic redistribution that a pure democracy could theoretically impose. There's a quote our source uses about Russian Jewish immigrants who experienced Soviet communism.
Right. Anything that remotely resembles that, they hate it, they despise it.
Exactly. So these Americans, having seen the alternatives, often voted for political leaders who promised to protect free markets and private property rights.
But, and this is important, they also expected those leaders to provide public goods and address market failures. Things like fighting crime, preventing monopolies, protecting the environment. They wanted the system to work fairly, not just be a free-for-all.
So it's a balance. They supported leaders who protected the core principles of free enterprise while also using democratic government to smooth the rough edges and ensure broader benefit.
Okay, so let's circle back to that initial critique. Stronger democracy requires weaker capitalism. What does all this suggest?
It suggests the relationship is much more complicated, doesn't it? And often, maybe even usually, mutually reinforcing. Democracy and capitalism aren't necessarily enemies. They can actually thrive together in a kind of balanced ecosystem.
But that ecosystem needs the right atmosphere, as our source puts it. And that atmosphere is the trust generated by civic virtue. When that degrades, when the air gets poisoned by distrust and lack of virtue.
And neither democracy nor capitalism can really function properly. They both start to break down.
Which leads us directly into looking at the evidence for that degradation. Just how bad is the erosion of trust?
Yeah, let's get into the numbers. Because when we talk about this societal atmosphere degrading, it's not just a vague feeling. We can actually measure it. And the data on the erosion of trust in the U.S. is, it's pretty sobering.
Where do we start?
The General Social Survey, the GSS, is a good place. They've been asking Americans about trust since way back in 1972. They ask a simple question. Generally speaking, would you say that most people can be trusted or that you can't be too careful in dealing with people?
Okay, what's the trend?
Well, back in the 1970s, the responses were roughly split, about even between most people can be trusted and you can't be too careful.
And now?
By the 2010s, the answers were running about 2-to-1 in favor of no trust.
2-to-1 against trusting others.
Yeah.
Wow. That's a huge shift, a 1/3 erosion in just general social trust. That indicates a really profound change in how we view each other, our fellow citizens.
It really does, and it's not just an abstract decline. Pew Research Center found in 2019 that 64% of Americans agreed that trust in each other was shrinking. They felt it happening.
And didn't they also ask about perceptions of typical Americans?
Yeah, this one is really striking. In 2015, Pew found that 68% described the typical American as selfish.
68%.
Get this. That was actually slightly higher than the percentage who described Americans as intelligent, which was 67%.
Wait, so more people thought the average American was selfish than thought they were intelligent?
According to that poll, yes.
Oof. That's a deeply uncomfortable mirror to hold up, isn't it? If a majority of us genuinely believe that about each other, that we're fundamentally selfish, how do you even begin to rebuild collective trust from that starting point?
It's a huge challenge. And this decline in trust, it's not just between individuals. It extends right across the board to the institutions that rely on that social trust. Gallup's long-running confidence institution surveys paint a pretty bleak picture here.
Okay, let's break some of those down. What about the press, the media?
Plummeted. Confidence fell from 39% back in 1973 down to just 18% in 2023.
18%, that's incredibly low.
And it gets worse. It's not just distrust of news sources people don't like. In 2019, 61% believe the media intentionally ignores stories that are important. And by 2020, two-thirds, 67%, said even their own preferred news sources presented factual information to favor one side.
So even the sources people choose, they suspect bias.
And get this, 37% said their preferred sources actually reported made-up information intended to mislead the public.
Wow. So over a third think even their chosen news sources are sometimes just making stuff up. That's a complete breakdown of the information ecosystem we rely on.
It really is. What about higher education, universities?
Similar story, though maybe not quite as dramatic yet. Confidence fell from 57% in 2015 down to 36% in 2023. And Pew found that the percentage of Americans saying colleges have a negative effect on the country actually rose from 26% to 38% between 2012 and 2019.
So growing skepticism there, too.
And religion.
Churches or organized religion. Confidence has more than halved. It was 65% in 1973, down to just 32% in 2023. Okay, so social institutions are taking a hit. What about legal and political trust? Government itself.
Same downward trend. Confidence in the U.S. Supreme Court went from 45% in 73 to only 27% in 2023.
Less than a third.
Yeah. And trust in government in general. Pew data shows it plunged from a high of 72% way back in 1958 down to just 19% by 2015.
19%.
19%. And that perception of corruption is really widespread. In 2020, 67% of Americans agreed with the statement, most politicians are corrupt.
Two-thirds think politicians are corrupt. How does that compare internationally?
It's much higher than in comparable countries like France, Germany, or the UK. It suggests a particularly deep perception of ethical failure right here.
Are there any institutions that have held up relatively well?
Well, the military consistently polls highest. It was at 60% confidence in 2023, which is actually slightly up from 58% in 1975. The police have seen a dip, down about 9 points from 52% in 1993 to 43% in 2023, but still higher than many other institutions.
Okay, and business. How does the corporate world fare?
Not great. Confidence in the medical system, for example, was way up at 80% in 1975. By the early 90s, it was down in the 30s and 40s. It got a temporary bump during COVID, understandably, but then fell back to 34% by 2023.
And banks. Big business.
Banks dropped from 50% confidence in 1979 to 27% in 2022. And big business, from 34% in 1975 down to a really startling low of 14% in 2022.
Only 14% have confidence in big business. Wow. Okay, so taken together, these numbers paint a really stark picture. Trust has eroded almost everywhere.
It's a broad-based crisis of confidence, absolutely. But the numbers only tell part of the story. What's actually driving this? Our sources argue it's not just random dissatisfaction. It reflects a deeper underlying cultural shift. They call it the culture of contempt.
The culture of contempt. What does that mean?
It's where the basic way we interact with each other, especially across ideological divides, is breaking down. It's characterized by this dynamic where ordinary members of one ideological side believe themselves motivated by love, while ordinary members of the other side are motivated by hate.
So my side is good, your side is evil.
Essentially, yes. And if you start from that assumption that the other side is motivated by hate, that they're fundamentally illegitimate or even evil, what follows?
Well, you'd assume they're always trying to cheat you, right?
Right.
In business, in elections, whatever.
Exactly. The source says, we will naturally assume that we are being cheated, and we will find it acceptable to take advantage of our opponents or even use force against them because they are evil.
That sounds dangerous. The by any means necessary mindset.
It is dangerous.
Yeah.
The source notes that many activists today openly use that slogan, by any means necessary, to justify their actions, which is pretty ominous when you think about where that logic leads. It creates this vicious cycle where contempt and distrust just fuel more contempt and distrust.
Is there anything else feeding into this, culturally speaking?
Well, another fascinating and maybe related cultural shift highlighted is what psychologist Jean Twenge calls the narcissism epidemic.
Narcissism, like clinical narcissism.
Not necessarily clinical disorder for everyone, but definitely rising narcissistic traits in the general population. And the evidence seems to support it. For example, the percentage of Western teenagers agreeing with the statement, I am an important person, shot up from 12% in 1963 to around 80% by 1992.
12 to 80%, that's a staggering increase.
It is. And studies using the Narcissistic Personality Inventory, a standard measure, found that grandiose narcissism increased by 30% just between 1979 and 2006.
Okay, so narcissistic traits seem to be rising. How does that connect to the decline in civility and trust?
The connection is pretty direct, according to researchers. People with higher levels of narcissism often have this inflated sense of entitlement. They tend to see slights and insults everywhere, even when none are intended.
They get easily offended.
Very easily aggrieved, yes. They feel victimized by everyday interactions, even minor things. And in a culture where everyone feels like a potential victim or aggressor.
Civility kind of goes out the window.
Exactly. Because almost any behavior can be justified as self-defense against a perceived attack. It becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy of conflict and suspicion.
And does this extend to leadership?
It seems to. The argument is that an increasingly narcissistic population is more likely to embrace narcissistic leaders. Researchers have found that populist politicians, and we've certainly seen more of them lately, tend to display traits associated with narcissism, but also Machiavellianism and psychopathy.
The dark triad of personality traits.
That's the one.
Yeah.
And it gets worse because there's often this whole commercial infrastructure in social media, even conventional media, that promotes these kinds of leaders. Why?
Because conflict sells, outrage gets clicks.
Precisely. Conflict sells. Outrage generates engagement. So the media environment can end up amplifying the most divisive and narcissistic voices because it's profitable. Our source is pretty blunt about this. It is hard to imagine anything more harmful to civility and honesty than a political system that rewards such people.
So putting it all together, the source argues that blaming capitalism or democracy itself for the rise of populism and division is missing the deeper point.
Right. Some might say, see, the commercial media promoting populists proves capitalism harms democracy.
Right.
But this source argues it's looking at it the wrong way. It says the problem is more about uncivil people supporting dark triad leaders, combined with this commercial exploitation of division, which it calls a kind of market failure, like pollution or crime.
So the ultimate root cause, in this view, isn't the sister itself, but something underneath it.
Yes, it circles back to that core idea. The most plausible root cause remains the decline of civic virtue. The breakdown in character, honesty, civility, and trust is poisoning the well for everything else.
Okay, so if civic virtue is really this foundational, maybe we need to zoom out a bit and look at the broader philosophical tradition it comes from, which is virtue ethics, right?
Exactly. Virtue ethics is a whole approach to morality that doesn't just focus on, say, the consequences of actions, like utilitarianism, or following specific rules, like deontology. Instead, it puts the emphasis squarely on character. Who are we as people? What kind of traits or virtues should we cultivate?
And this goes way back.
Oh yeah, deep roots in ancient Greek philosophy. Aristotle in particular really systematized it in his Nicomachean Ethics.
What was his core idea?
Aristotle argued that virtues are like the sweet spot. They're mean states between excess and deficiency. So courage is the mean between cowardice, deficiency, and rashness, excess. Generosity is the mean between stinginess and extravagance.
Finding the balance.
Finding the balance. And crucially, he said, you don't just have virtue, you acquire it through practice and habituation. It's like learning a skill or building a muscle. You get better at being courageous by acting courageously, repeatedly.
So it's about developing good habits of character. And what was the goal of all this virtue?
The ultimate goal for Aristotle was something called the eudaimonia. It's often translated as happiness, but it's much richer than just a fleeting feeling. It's more like flourishing or living well or a life well lived.
Okay, so eudaimonia is the goal. And how do virtues help you get there?
The virtues, which Aristotle called erode, meaning excellence or virtue, are the very qualities that enable you to achieve eudaimonia. Living virtuously is living well, in his view.
Got it. And there was another key concept too, wasn't there? Something about wisdom?
Yes, phronesis, or practical wisdom. This is absolutely crucial. It's not just about knowing what virtue is in theory. It's about having the wisdom to figure out how to act virtuously in complex, messy, real-world situations. It's the ability to deliberate well and make good judgments in practice.
So you need the virtues themselves and the practical wisdom to apply them correctly.
Exactly. And it's important to remember, this isn't just some dusty old philosophy. There's been a real revival of interest in virtue ethics in recent decades. Philosophers like Alasdair MacIntyre and Martha Nussbaum have been applying these Aristotelian ideas to contemporary issues, showing how relevant they still are to our own struggles with ethics and politics.
But applying ancient ideas directly to modern life, that can be tricky, right? I mean, Aristotle had some specific ideas about virtue that might not sit well today.
Absolutely. That's a key challenge. Aristotle boldly claimed that everyone wants happiness, eudaimonia, and the best way to get it is through virtue. He even gave detailed descriptions of virtues he thought were pretty much indisputable.
Like the megalosychos, the great-souled person.
Exactly. Aristotle's description of the megalosychos, the person possessing magnanimity, the virtue that supposedly includes all others. Well, to modern ears, it can sound kind of obnoxious, maybe even sexist. This great-souled man is described as truthful, calm, unconcerned with others' opinions, having incredibly high self-esteem. Aristotle implies this confidence is backed by real achievements, but you could easily read it today as just, well, extreme narcissism. He thinks of himself as superior.
Yeah, that doesn't really vibe with modern values like egalitarianism or humility.
Not at all. It really highlights how our understanding of what even counts as a virtue can change dramatically across cultures and time periods. What seemed like the pinnacle of character to Aristotle might look very different, even problematic to us.
That's a really important point when we're talking about a crisis of civic virtue today. Maybe our shared understanding of virtue itself is part of the problem.
It could be. And another nuance in Aristotle is that virtue isn't just about acting right. It's also about feeling right. He argued that experiencing emotions appropriately is a key part of virtue and flourishing. It's not just cold, rational calculation. It involves engaging with your emotional life in a healthy way.
And that idea of eudaimonia, flourishing, it wasn't just a state of mind, was it?
No, not just a temporary feeling. He saw it as an ongoing journey, a lifelong pursuit. He acknowledged that there's an element of luck involved. Two things outside our control can impact our flourishing. You could be on the right path, but unpredictable events could derail you.
So it's a continuous process. As he famously said, one swallow does not make a spring. You need consistent effort over time.
Exactly. And two things about Aristotle's view really stand out. First, practice is essential. Nobody's born virtuous. It's a constant effort, a struggle sometimes. He even described a continuum. There's true virtue, but also people who struggle but manage to act right, continence, people who struggle and fail, acrasia or weakness of will, and even those who knowingly choose badly, viciousness. It acknowledges that being good is hard work.
And the second key point.
That comes from Alasdair MacIntyre, the modern virtue ethicist. He argued that virtue ethics is inherently a site of conflict. Different societies, different groups will have rival ideas about what virtues matter most. He contrasted the ancient Greek view of virtue as fundamentally social, tied to your role and duties within the community, with a modern tendency to see individuals as unique, apart from the context.
Which sounds a lot like our current debates about individual rights versus collective responsibilities, doesn't it?
It maps onto it very closely. And that brings us to some really interesting modern psychological research that tries to bridge this gap. How can we talk about virtue and well-being today, even if we don't all agree on a single list of virtues like Aristotle did?
Okay, where does the psychology come in?
It comes in with a concept called mentalized affectivity, or MA. It stems from mentalization theory in psychology and is described as a sophisticated form of emotion regulation.
Mentalized affectivity. Sounds complex. Break it down.
Think of it like developing a really advanced understanding of emotions, both your own and other people's. It's not just thinking about feelings. It's about deeply understanding where they come from, what they mean, and how to manage them effectively. It's about connecting your thoughts and feelings about feelings.
Okay, like an emotional intelligence superpower.
Kind of, yeah. The theory breaks MA down into three related aspects. First is identifying emotions. This isn't just slapping a label like sad or angry on a feeling. It's about being curious, digging deeper, understanding the nuances, connecting emotions to your personal history and their deeper meaning.
So self-reflection on feelings. What's next?
Second is processing emotions. This is about actively engaging with them, modulating their intensity, managing difficult feelings, tolerating discomfort, distinguishing between complex or mixed emotions. It's not about suppressing feelings, but working with them constructively.
And the third aspect?
Expressing emotions. This covers the whole range, from communicating feelings effectively to others, but also, interestingly, processing and understanding them internally, something often developed in therapy. The core idea of MA theory is that learning to tolerate and learn from negative emotions is actually critical for well-being. It encourages curiosity about all emotions without necessarily being ruled by them.
That sounds quite different from just trying to feel happy all the time.
Very different, and there's empirical evidence supporting it. A study developed a scale to measure MA, the Mentalized Affectivity Scale, or MAS, and tested it on over 500 adults.
What did they find?
They found that scores on the MAS significantly predicted people's satisfaction with life, even after accounting for demographics and other common measures of emotion regulation. This suggests MA is capturing something unique and important for well-being.
Okay, that's interesting. Any other key findings?
Yes, and this one is really nuanced. They found that the processing aspect of MA, the ability to modulate, manage, tolerate, distinguish emotions, acted as a protective factor for mental health. Higher processing skills were linked to lower levels of psychopathology.
That makes sense. Better emotional management, better mental health.
But here's the twist. The identifying aspect, being curious, naming, trying to make sense of emotions, actually seemed to contribute slightly to psychopathology in their sample.
Wait, trying to identify your emotions made things worse. That seems counterintuitive.
It does. The researchers speculated why. Maybe people who already have mental health struggles spend a lot of time trying to identify and make sense of their difficult emotions, but perhaps they do it in an unproductive, ruminative way if they lack the processing skills to actually work through those feelings constructively.
Ah, okay. So just identifying isn't enough. You need the processing skills too. It's the combination that matters.
Exactly. The effectiveness of MA seems to lie in engaging with both positive and negative emotions constructively. This contrasts sharply with approaches that just try to suppress negative feelings, which often backfire, leading to rebound effects, emotional exhaustion, and making it harder to even distinguish between your feelings.
So MA sounds a bit like some modern therapies. Mindfulness, ACT.
It definitely aligns with those third-wave behavioral therapies that focus on changing your relationship to your thoughts and feelings, rather than trying to eliminate the bad ones. But MA has this distinct emphasis on active, reflective engagement. It's not just passive acceptance. It's about understanding emotions in context, your history, your hopes, cultural expectations, and using that understanding to navigate life better.
Now, the study had limitations, right? Self-report, mostly white U.S. sample.
Yes, definitely. But the research is expanding. The MAS is being translated into about 15 languages, so future work can explore cultural differences. For instance, the value placed on openly expressing emotions might be very different in East Asian cultures compared to the West.
So this modern psychological take on emotion regulation, how does it connect back to Aristotle and virtue? It feels like a modern way of talking about that inner balance and practical wisdom he emphasized.
I think that's a great way to put it. It underscores that even if we debate the specific content of virtues across time and culture, the fundamental human capacity for self-awareness, thoughtful emotional regulation, and constructive engagement with our inner world that seems to be a timeless ingredient for both individual flourishing, eudaimonia, and by extension, for building a more civil, functional, and trusting society. It's about cultivating that internal strength that then allows us to engage better with the world and each other.
That connection between our internal state and how society functions leads us perfectly into this next section. We found this really active debate happening on Reddit centered around a provocative statement.
Which was?
An ethically virtuous society is one in which members meet individual obligations to fulfill collective moral principles. Worry less about your rights and more about your responsibilities.
Ooh, okay. That definitely sounds like it would spark some debate. Worry less about rights, more about responsibilities.
Yeah.
That gets right to the heart of civic virtue in action.
Exactly. And the arguments flew back and forth. Let's start with the side arguing for focusing more on responsibilities. What were their main points?
Well, one core perspective was just that. A truly virtuous society requires individuals to prioritize their obligations to the collective good over just asserting their own rights. It's about selfless action versus a potentially selfish focus on what's mine.
Did they give any examples?
Someone brought up Australia's COVID lockdowns. The argument was that people there temporarily gave up certain individual rights, freedom of movement, etc., for the sake of collective health. And because they did, they got better outcomes, and importantly, those rights eventually returned. It was framed as an act of societal trust, not just blind obedience.
Okay, what else?
There was this related idea that some level of societal authority is actually necessary and good, and that being overly paranoid about government authority can backfire, making people vulnerable to actual authoritarians who use anti-government rhetoric to gain power.
Interesting point.
Someone else made a more philosophical argument. As the world gets more crowded, individual agency naturally decreases. Think about it. On a desert island, your freedom is almost total. On a packed city bus, not so much.
Right. Your actions impact others more directly.
Exactly. So the argument goes, as society becomes more interconnected, a certain decrease in absolute individual rights might be necessary, maybe even inevitable. This led one person to even suggest a one-world government is inevitable eventually.
Wow, okay. That's a big leap.
It is. But the core idea was about the limits of individualism in a dense society. Others argued more moderately that rights and responsibilities are basically inseparable. You can't have one without the other. In fact, they said, protecting human rights for everyone is itself a fundamental collective responsibility.
So the responsibility is to uphold the rights.
Precisely. And they stressed that we need collective moral principles and actions to tackle huge collective problems. Think climate change, systemic injustice. Individual actions alone just aren't enough. You need that sense of shared responsibility.
Trust came up again too, right?
Yes, the idea that societal trust is absolutely critical to weather an emergency, but trust requires reciprocity, everyone doing their part.
There's also a nuanced point about free speech.
Yeah, that was interesting. The argument was that the right to free speech only really works if individuals also accept an obligation of tolerance. If society uses informal methods, social ostracism, cancel culture, deplatforming to shut down dissent, then the right is effectively meaningless, even if the government isn't directly involved. We have a responsibility to allow differing views.
And finally, a sense that our duties go beyond just what the law requires.
Right. Duties exist above and beyond what the state compels. We have moral obligations as citizens and humans that aren't just about following the legal minimum.
Okay, so that's a strong case for prioritizing responsibilities for the collective good. But I imagine there was significant pushback.
Oh, definitely. The arguments prioritizing the protection of rights were just as passionate, if not more so.
What were the main counter-arguments?
A big one was skepticism about those temporary emergency measures. Many people argued that when citizens give up rights, even supposedly temporarily, those rights often never return. They pointed to things like the surveillance measures put in place in the U.S. after 9/11, which are still largely active decades later.
The temporary becomes permanent.
That was the fear. One person put it bluntly, "I have no faith that any rights given or taken will be returned." There was also a fundamental challenge to the whole idea of where rights come from.
How so?
Some argued forcefully that rights do come from governments. If a government can deny it, it's not a true right, it's just a privilege. This perspective dismissed the idea of inherent natural rights as utterly baseless. One commenter even starkly said, the only right you truly possess is the right to die.
So a very different philosophical starting point about the nature of rights themselves. Are they inherent or granted?
Exactly. And that led to a really powerful analogy someone used, comparing certain kinds of rights to slavery.
Slavery, how did they make that connection?
They argued that if you claim a right to something that requires another person's labor, like health care provided by a doctor, or benefits paid for by taxpayers, you're essentially claiming a right to someone else's work. And having a right to someone else's labor is, they argued, fundamentally akin to slavery.
Wow. How did they distinguish that from other rights?
They contrasted it with rights that don't compel others' labor, freedom of speech, freedom of thought, the right to simply exist. Those belong solely to the individual. But a right to money or housing or a doctor's time, one person said, hell no. They might agree those things are good societal benefits, but calling them rights was seen as dangerous territory.
That's a stark way of framing it. What about cynicism towards government itself?
Plenty of that, too. The argument was made. Governments are run by people, politicians seeking re-election. They do act in self-interest. So if citizens just passively focus on their responsibilities without actively defending their rights, they open themselves up to exploitation by those in power.
And historical warnings came up.
Definitely. Benjamin Franklin's famous quote was invoked. Any society that will give up a little liberty to gain a little security will deserve neither and lose both. And even more chillingly, people pointed to Nazi Germany.
How is that relevant?
Critics noted that the Nazi regime suspended individual rights while simultaneously pushing propaganda about responsibility and duty to the fatherland. It was used as a stark historical warning about where prioritizing state-defined responsibility over individual rights can lead.
Were other regimes mentioned?
Yeah, the claim was made that all socialist regimes suspend rights during the revolutionary phase, arguing that this phase often becomes permanent, effectively eliminating rights indefinitely.
There was also an argument about the government's responsibility first, right?
Yes. The idea that the government has to hold up its end of the bargain. If the state lies, cuts education, fails to provide basic services or welfare, then, as one person put it, it's no wonder its citizens will not look out for the welfare of the state instead of themselves. Loyalty has to be earned.
And just plain old individualism came through, too.
Oh, yeah. very strongly from some. Comments like, "No one is responsible for me, and I am not responsible for anyone else besides my family." A real emphasis on individual autonomy and a deep fear of unchecked authority leading to dystopian nightmares.
Did anyone question how responsibility gets applied in practice?
Yes, that was a sharp critique. Someone observed that during the COVID lockdowns, many wealthier people could work from home via Zoom, while the poorest among us just went to work like normal. This raised questions like, why do the mechanisms of capitalism disappear into the void the millisecond it comes to the poor? And why are the lowest paid, essential workers suddenly bearing the biggest responsibility? It questioned the fairness of how these burdens are distributed.
So a real concern about responsibility being used to exploit the vulnerable.
Exactly. And a general agreement on the need for constant criticism and judgment of politicians and processes. Some dismissed the responsibility-first idea as naive, a brain-dead take, or even compared it to authoritarian thinking, saying it's just a nice way to get exploited for your entire life.
Wow. Okay, so this whole complex, fiery debate between rights and responsibilities, it really makes you think of Plato's Republic, doesn't it? He was grappling with similar fundamental questions thousands of years ago.
Absolutely. The central questions Socrates asks in the Republic are, what is justice? And crucially, is the just person happier than the unjust person? He's trying to figure out the relationship between individual character, societal structure, and ultimate well-being.
And his method was to design an ideal city in theory, right? The Callipolis.
Exactly. He constructs this just city in speech as a way to understand justice on a large scale, and then he applies that understanding, by analogy, to the individual human soul.
So what did this ideal city look like? Remind us of the key features.
Well, it's famously ruled by philosopher kings, wise rulers who supposedly grasp the ultimate forms, including the form of the good, and can therefore rule justly. Below them are the guardians, the military class, and they have a very unique lifestyle prescribed for them.
No private property, communal living.
Right. No private property, little privacy. They get their necessities from the city through taxation. They live and eat together communally. Plato even specifies no separate families among the guardians' children are raised collectively.
And strict control over education and culture.
Extremely strict. Heavy censorship of poetry, music, and stories to ensure they only promote the right civic virtues like courage, moderation, and obedience. And maybe most controversially, Plato includes a system of eugenics, a rigged lottery to pair up the best guardians to produce fit offspring, while discouraging reproduction among the inferior.
Yeah, it's easy to see why this vision has attracted so much criticism over the centuries.
Definitely. Commentators have seen elements of socialism in the communal aspects and the focus on the city's overall happiness. But others see clear elements of fascism or totalitarianism, the extreme censorship, the noble lies used to maintain stability, the restriction of power to a tiny elite, centralized control, suppression of freedom. Karl Popper famously delivered a scathing critique along these lines. Some even point to communistic elements, like the communal ownership for the guardians.
It's a challenging blueprint. And how did he connect this city back to the individual, the analogy of the soul?
Right. He argued the city's main virtues correspond to parts of the individual soul. Wisdom, found in the rulers, corresponds to the rational part of the soul, reason, thinking. Courage in the military corresponds to the spirited part, emotions, ambition, righteous anger. Moderation, the agreement on who should rule, reflects a harmony between all parts. And justice, both in the city and the soul, means each part is doing its own proper job and not interfering with the others.
So justice is about internal balance and harmony, each part playing its role.
That's Socrates' definition within the dialogue. Justice in the soul means reason rules, supported by the spirited part, keeping the appetitive part, desires for food, drink, sex, money, in check. This creates a natural, healthy balance.
But there's a famous problem with this argument, isn't there? The critique by David Sachs.
Yes, the fallacy in Plato's Republic. Sachs argued back in the 1960s that Socrates basically changes the subject. He sets out to prove that being just, in the ordinary sense, like not stealing, not murdering, not cheating, is always better for you than being unjust. But what Socrates actually ends up defending is the value of having a balanced, harmonious soul, what Sachs called psychic health or rationality.
So the disconnect is?
The disconnect is that Sachs argued Socrates fails to show a clear causal or logical connection between having this balanced soul and actually acting justly towards other people. Why would someone with a perfectly balanced soul necessarily refrain from committing adultery if they thought they could get away with it, or refrain from stealing a book if it helped their pursuit of knowledge?
Right. The link between internal harmony and external social behavior isn't automatically proven.
Exactly, that's the alleged fallacy. And it's been a major challenge for interpreters of Plato ever since. How do you bridge that gap? How do you show that this inner psychic health necessarily leads to conventional justice?
Have there been attempts to bridge it?
Many. Some argue that just person's love of knowledge itself prevents unjust actions, but Sachs countered, what if stealing aids knowledge? Others say knowledge of the good directly motivates just actions, but that might only apply to the philosopher kings. Another view is the just person's love of the forms motivates them to instantiate justice in the world.
But again, that seems limited to the philosophers. What about everyone else? Why should they be conventionally just?
This is where a more recent interpretation by Rachana Singh Purwala comes in, which tries to provide a reason for everyone. She argues that Socrates does give a reason. Acting justly satisfies a fundamental, deeply ingrained human need, the need to be unified with others.
Unified with others, how does that work?
Her argument is that our happiness is deeply tied to having good relationships and feeling connected to a community. She points to Plato's description of the miserable, isolated tyrant as evidence. Acting unjustly, by definition, involves disregarding the good of others, which is incompatible with genuine unity and connection. Therefore, injustice undermines our own happiness because it isolates us and thwarts this basic human need for positive social bonds.
Okay, so being just isn't just good for the soul's internal balance. It's also essential for fulfilling our social nature and achieving happiness through connection with others. That ties the I and the we together more directly.
Exactly. It aimed to provide a universal reason, rooted in human nature, for everyone to choose justice over injustice.
So Plato's Republic, even with all its controversial elements that make us uncomfortable today, really did lay out these enduring questions about how social structures, individual character, and justice intertwine. Questions that are clearly still incredibly relevant in our own debates about rights, responsibilities, and the common good. Okay, after digging through all the declining trust numbers, the culture of contempt, the historical warnings, it might feel a bit bleak. But our main source, that Crisis of Civic Virtue article, actually ends on a more hopeful note.
It does. It cites data from the research group More in Common from 2018. They found that a huge majority, 93% of Americans, said they were tired of how divided America has become.
93%.
Yeah. And large majorities also said we need to learn to compromise and work together to solve our biggest problems. The takeaway was that people seemed to genuinely crave a stronger sense of national community.
So underneath all the division and frustration, there's maybe this shared exhaustion and a desire for something better.
That's the interpretation. Maybe people are recognizing that decades of hyper-individualism haven't delivered the promised happiness, but instead have led to more anger, isolation, and unhappiness. And if that's true, it represents a major opportunity for national renewal.
Okay, so if the appetite for renewal is there, where do we start? How do we actually rebuild this civic virtue and trust?
Well, a key starting point, according to our sources, is civil society. Those non-governmental organizations, community groups, charities, faith-based organizations, neighborhood associations, the whole fabric of local life outside of government and business.
Why start there?
Peter Berger and Richard John Newhouse argued way back in 1977 in their book To Empower People that civic virtue needs these kinds of institutions. They act as buffers, protecting citizens from the big, impersonal forces, big government, big corporations that can atomize us and shrink our incentives to cooperate. These local groups are where we practice working together.
They're like the training grounds for cooperation and trust.
Exactly. And Yuval Levin makes a similar point more recently in A Time to Build. He argues that the only way to address our current problems of isolation and a frayed civic fabric is by reviving and building institutions that can meet our needs while also drawing us together. It's in these smaller, tangible communities that we rebuild civic muscle.
Can government play any role in fostering this? Or should it stay out?
Government can potentially help, the sources suggest. One way is by supporting schools that actually teach a mix of practical skills, morals, and wisdom, not just job training, but character education too.
But there's debate about whether current public schools do that effectively.
Right. That's why the source mentions the school choice movement. The idea there is that allowing public funds to follow students to different schools, public-private charter, could break the monopolistic model and give parents more options to find schools that align with their values and focus on character development alongside academics.
What about outside of schools? Any other government roles?
Another idea floated is expanding national service opportunities. Things like the military, obviously, but also the Peace Corps, AmeriCorps, maybe even new programs. The goal could be to bring diverse citizens together across divides as problem solvers, working on common projects, rather than just being passive individual consumers of government services.
So shared experiences to build common ground and purpose.
That's the hope. Now, we also have to talk about universities, the big knowledge institutions. Because kind of paradoxically, they've been accused of actually contributing to the culture of contempt.
How so?
The concern, voiced by many, is that the range of acceptable viewpoints, the diversity of perspectives allowed for open debate, has narrowed significantly on many campuses. This gets tied up with debates around cancel culture. And the result, critics say, is that it stifles open inquiry and has lowered public confidence, with some arguing higher education is actually having a negative impact overall.
So what are the proposed fixes for universities?
The source suggests a few things. A renewed, strong commitment to principles of free speech and free expression for everyone on campus. Policies where the university as an institution avoids taking official stances on contentious social and political issues, allowing diverse views among faculty and students. And a clear repudiation of cancel culture and its chilling effects on open discussion.
The goal being to return universities to a role where they foster robust debate and critical thinking rather than ideological conformity.
Exactly, to make them constructive parts of civil society again. Now, we can't just focus on civil society and education. We also have to look at the private economy, free enterprise itself. It doesn't get a pass.
Okay. How does free enterprise fit into reviving civic virtue? Some critiques blame it for the decline.
Well, the source argues that the biggest flaw in that argument is misunderstanding what proper free enterprise actually is. Proponents of capitalism, going all the way back to Adam Smith, have always acknowledged that markets aren't perfect. They can fail.
Market failures. Like what?
Like monopolies forming and stifling competition. Or when businesses create external costs. Pollution is the classic example that society bears, but the company doesn't pay for. The source even mentions cultural pollution as potential externality.
Cultural pollution. What might that mean?
Perhaps things like media that coarsens public discourse, or industries that promote unhealthy behaviors. Also, markets can fail when there are public goods. We all need, like, national defense or clean air that private companies have little incentive to provide on their own, or when information or power gets concentrated in too few hands.
So these failures aren't inherent to capitalism, but potential problems within it that need addressing.
That's the argument. Things like cronyistic lobbying efforts that rig the rules, misinformation-producing media platforms, anti-competitive monopolies, these actually do violence to the principles of a truly free and fair market system. They induce market failures.
So the solution isn't necessarily less capitalism, but
better capitalism. This leads to a really fascinating conclusion in the source. Stronger regulatory enforcement would improve both democracy and capitalism.
wow. So regulation isn't the enemy of capitalism, but potentially its savior by correcting its flaws and ensuring it serves the common good.
That's the provocative idea. It challenges the conventional wisdom that there's always a trade-off. It connects back to Adam Smith arguing for a proper balance. The source insists there's nothing inherently corrupt about capitalism itself. The problem is when we, the operators within the system, become corrupt. So the right focus, it concludes, starts with ourselves, striving for virtues such as civility and honesty toward one another, and even love.
Which brings us right back around to personal virtue being the foundation.
Absolutely. Our other source, Virtues as Foundation of Morality, really hammers this home. Virtues are the bedrock of good governance, and good governance is what facilitates the common good. Without that moral foundation, the best designed systems will eventually fail.
And what does good governance look like in practice?
The source lists several characteristics. It needs to be participatory, consensus-oriented, accountable, transparent, responsive, effective and efficient, equitable and inclusive, and it must follow the rule of law. It also needs prudence in decision-making and to consider all stakeholders.
And unethical practices like corruption obviously undermine all of that.
Completely. Corruption wastes public funds, deprives people of basic needs and rights, destroys public trust, breeds inefficiency. It's poison to good governance.
So how do we restore ethical practices? What's the key?
The human element is critical. It involves individual values, the values promoted by the community, and, importantly, political will from leaders at all levels. Community education is vital, raising awareness about the damage unethical practices cause and promoting meritocracy.
Meritocracy appointing people based on ability, not connections.
Exactly. The opposite of nepotism or favoritism. And crucially, it's not an either between punishment and values. Experience shows you need both. You need legislative reform laws against corruption with real teeth, the discipline approach. But you also need the values approach, actively promoting moral values and ethical principles within institutions. Combining both is what leads to significant and sustainable impact.
So structure and character again, laws and values working together.
Precisely. It reinforces that idea that morality isn't just an individual thing, the I. It's fundamentally about the collective, the we. The source suggests a direct proportionality. The more virtue individuals possess, the more virtuous the society becomes. Our collective character really does shape our collective destiny.
You know, this whole conversation, weaving together history, philosophy, psychology, economics, it reminds me of that powerful quote from Martin Luther King Jr. He wrote it back in 1947 in an essay called The Purpose of Education.
What did he say?
We must remember that intelligence is not enough. Intelligence plus character, that is the goal of true education.
Wow. Intelligence plus character. That really does tie it all together perfectly, doesn't it? It's about cultivating the whole person, intellectually and morally, for the good of the individual and the whole society. Hashtag tag tag outro. So we started this deep dive with Ben Franklin's challenge, that question hanging in the air. A republic, if you can keep it. We looked at the current identity crisis, that widespread feeling that American democracy is in trouble, and explored the common explanations, polarization, critiques of capitalism.
Right, but we found that maybe the real root lies deeper, in the decline of civic virtue and trust. We journeyed back to see how foundational these concepts were for the founders, for observers like Tocqueville, and even how they connect to free enterprise.
Then we dove into the sobering numbers showing just how much trust has eroded across almost all major institutions. We linked that to the rise of a culture of contempt and even measurable increases in narcissistic traits in society.
We explored the ancient wisdom of virtue ethics, Aristotle's ideas about flourishing, eudaimonia, through virtue, erode, and practical wisdom, phronesis. And we connected that to cutting-edge psychological research on mentalized affectivity, showing how sophisticated emotional understanding and regulation contribute to well-being today.
And we definitely didn't shy away from that complex, thorny debate between individual rights and collective responsibilities. We saw how arguments on Reddit mirrored deep philosophical tensions, present even in Plato's Republic questions about justice, the ideal society, and whether inner balance guarantees outward good behavior.
Finally, we looked at potential paths forward, rebuilding civil society from the community level up, rethinking education and national service, reforming universities to foster open inquiry, and ensuring free enterprise actually serves the common good by addressing its failures.
The consistent thread, really, from Adam Smith through to Martin Luther King Jr., seems to be the absolute necessity of personal character, of individual virtue, as the bedrock for a healthy, thriving, and trusting society.
So here's a final thought for you, listening right now, to maybe chew on. If the essence of virtue, whether we look at ancient philosophy or modern psychology, really boils down to things like choosing the good, managing our emotions wisely, building trust, and considering others, how might consciously cultivating just one small civic virtue in your own daily life, maybe more civility online, maybe more honest engagement with people you disagree with, even when it's hard, how might that small personal act create a ripple effect? Could it contribute, even in a small way, to rebuilding the collective trust our society seems to desperately need? What stands out to you as the most impactful starting point for that kind of personal and maybe collective transformation?